this afternoon with Dean Revell. About a year ago, Dean established his own business, Revell Science, to provide a direct link between research and its application with landholders. He currently works on a project, Rangelands Self-Herding, which he's speaking about today, supported by Rangelands NRM, and he also interacts with farmers and researchers and regional NRM groups on a range of activities with livestock production. Dean was previously a principal research scientist with CSIRO in Perth for 9 years. Welcome, Dean.
Thanks, Robin, and terrific to be here and to be hearing about so many interesting and great opportunities. And I hope I can add to that today, talking to you about rangeland self-herding. It's a term that describes a very broad set of principles and practices, both, that's behaviour-based, that puts the manager of livestock in a position of positively influencing the behaviours of livestock, both in their location, their retention, their distribution, their movement, and indeed diet selection. I'm going to make use of the small amount of time I have with you to talk about some of the on-ground results that we've achieved over the last 6 to 12 months. And I hope not too frustratingly for you, not spending too much time on how it was achieved, but more than happy to talk to you about that if you're interested. I want to start and finish with a pretty simple statement. Animals can change. Simple but quite empowering. I probably don't need to convince you of that statement, but importantly is the next two components below it, that we can be active participants in that change, and the change can occur quickly and cheaply and have long-lasting benefits for the livestock and the landscape and the business enterprise of the pastoral business itself. Now, the sort of questions that we often hear, and I'm sure you either have or hear similar sorts of questions out there, relate to these sorts of things about why do animals seem to stay where they are even though there's good feed somewhere else? Can we distribute animals within a paddock to a new area? Can we diversify the diet of livestock? And it's these sorts of questions, and we're finding as we interact with pastoralists and putting it into practice a whole lot more, that we can address with the principles and practices of rangeland self-herding. So one of the things that we need to begin with is the view that what we see now need not be the way it is of the future, but the behaviours of the past are shaping the here and now as well. So we've seen it either in our children or in our livestock, the behaviour that may not be quite as we wish, never tried it, don't like it. When I started my career in animal nutrition, I always thought that the key components that fed diet selection, which is something I'm really very interested in, is the choice you give animals at any given point in time. They'll make a choice based on what you're offering. What they really do is make a choice based on what they've experienced in the past. So sure, they have to have it available to them to exercise that choice, but is the dominant factor in influencing diet selection and habitat selection is the experience that those animals have had in the past. Now find the balance between the neophobia of grazing animals, the fear of the new, and the desire to seek variety puts the opportunity back on us as the managers to say, how can we broaden their experiences so a broader range of locations and plants in the landscape become familiar to them so that they don't end up in a situation represented by this cartoon here. So I'm going to quickly go through 4 examples and I'm going to skim across them with the time just to show you the sorts of what we think are pretty exciting results that landholders have achieved under their commercial pressures and time constraints. We visited a place in the Kimberley early in the project, and shortly before we arrived to talk about the opportunities with rangeland self-herding, they were faced with a devastating fire. It was about 80% of the property that was impacted. So you can imagine they had their minds on a million things, and we thought the last thing they want to do is talk to us about a new opportunity. But in fact, it turned out to be a very useful discussion to have because they had some pretty urgent decisions to make in that early recovery phase. And some of those early decisions involved these set of circumstances here where cattle had to be collected from different parts of the property, brought to the yards and retained for a short period of time, and decisions were made about some were sent for agistment, some were sold, and some were to be relocated to a relatively small part of the station that hadn't burnt onto a brand new bore that had never been used before, so no animals that they were placing there had any experience of that water point at all. And what was of paramount importance to them was that those animals used that location and remained in that location in the foreseeable future, didn't disperse back to their home ranges, which would be something we'd typically expect animals to do, not to disperse and put undue grazing pressure on new growth that was already occurring post-fire, and certainly not to head east of the property where fences had been burnt and the risk of losing animals off property altogether. So a whole lot of time-constrained but high-pressure challenges, but an opportunity to see whether some of the principles we're talking about could indeed be put into practice. The green circle on the previous graph remains on here, and the blue dots are about 3 weeks of grazing locations of two animals that were in the mob that was placed out there. It was a mixed group that hadn't been as a single group before, mixed ages, mixed sex. The landholder used the beautiful term of establishing a new colony. And clearly you can see the location of those animals over that 3-year period was retained in the area, that they were desperate for that result. And if we drill down a little more closely and look at the tracks of those animals now over about a 4-week period, so these had GPS collars fitted to the animals, and there's two animals represented in this graph, one in the red and one in the blue line. The new boar that the animals were accessing is with the red arrow here, and you can see the grazing circuits that they established in a brand new location with a brand new group of animals and achieved this wonderful result. And as time progressed, and then some of the loops were getting bigger, and at about the 3-week mark, the blue cow decided to head back to her previous water point, which in itself is an intriguing result, but even more intriguing and perhaps understandable that she'd calved 3 days earlier before that move back to her previous home range. But she had chosen to stay in the new location until she calved, and when the calf was strong enough in her mind to relocate, that's what she did. But some of the self-herding practices that they were implementing diminished in intensity because they had a million other jobs to do as well, so it was still a desirable result. They did report that all of the animals that they were seeing regularly in their visits were now using multiple water points, including the new one, which they were very happy about. Here's another example further south in the Pilbara in Western Australia, and this particular property has a long, narrow paddock where the river is fenced off, which gives them a huge amount of flexibility in managing the backbone of their property in terms of economic performance and also the landscape health as well. Despite it being quite a narrow paddock, there's the scale of 4 kilometres down in the bottom corner. As you can imagine, there's still patchiness within that. So along the river, it's getting a fair working over from a large number of cattle. But there was a patch here where a water point had been, and for 6 years they tailed cattle to that water point and held them there for a day, and then to find that they'd return to the water the very next day. It was an area that was well abundant with feed. Roburn's plains grass and other grasses were in high supply and quite reasonable quality, but the cattle just didn't use it. It really was a case of never tried it, don't like it. So they implemented some pretty simple rangeland self-herding practices, and they're represented here in the comparison between the green line, which is the conventional management. They were taken to that water, but the animals returned back to use the river system. Whereas another group of cattle, and this is one animal, again with the GPS tracking collar representing that group, set up a brand new grazing circuit of their own. And the observation from the landholder was the group of cattle that were taken there behaved much more as a group than they had previously. So if we were to say, do cattle graze the river or not, I couldn't say yes they do or no they don't. It depends on our management. It depends on the experience that we've provided those animals and what elements of familiarity we had offered those animals so that their new home became something they were comfortable to do. They were not held there. They had the choice to head back to the river, which was only a kilometre or two away. They chose to stay there and established a new set of grazing circuits. Really encouraging and exciting result, I think. So the difference between management was the determining factor of the way the cattle were using that part of the landscape. A more ambitious program on another Pilbara property in a very large paddock, multiple land systems within that paddock, no and variable utilisation. The question is, could we influence grazing areas over time? So this is representation of that paddock and a known area of high utilisation down in the southwest corner. And what we were trying to do was to nudge, and I like that term that Fred Cheney used this morning, so I'm going to use it again, of nudging the behaviour of the cattle to head in a direction that was relatively underutilised. So here's the grazing distribution in the second half of October when the work was begun of 5 cattle with GPS collars. And the ellipse there is not me randomly drawing a circle, it's colleagues in CSIRO who've used the spatial analysis, and the ellipsoid shows the direction and the scale of utilisation of the animals in the landscape. And that's what I'll use over these next series of 3 images. So in October, when the work began, the area of high utilisation, and these are different water points. And as the months progressed with the implementation of strategies, which was using, as I'll explain a little bit more towards the end, of familiarity and attractants and rewards, we were indeed nudging the movement of those cattle in the direction that we desired. At a property in the Gascoyne showed very early in the project something we're seeing very often in a range of places, that when these practices are implemented, the behaviour of the cattle and their relationship to the human changes drastically. And one of the perhaps early rewards for land management is that animals that used to only show a cloud of dust and a tail disappearing over the hill are now very comfortable to be in the presence of people, including strangers, which was us visiting this particular property. This is a clean-skinned bull that hadn't really been seen much before, but was now very happy to be consuming water or the attractants that were placed in that area. High value to be able to opt to gather those animals with the price at the moment, but also think about mustering efficiency and the genetic implications if you can start collecting those animals and removing them from the landscape, if that's something you'd like to do. Now, the principles behind it are in the paper, and I don't have time to go through them, but we've condensed what we think is about 20 plus years of behavioural research and nutrition and physiology and ecological sciences into 7 principles. And we use that when we sit down with landholders to say, how can we be having multiplier effects with what we're doing that touch on the way we interact with animals, the feedback and experience animals gain, the diet diversity, their capacity to change, individuals and groups of animals influencing each other, and being very mindful, particularly in light of the talks we just had, about broad consequences. If we change grazing distribution, we'll be changing all sorts of other things, vegetation, other herbivores, predators, fire risk, etc. And sometimes those other elements can be the key driver for why someone wants to make a change. So the last couple of slides are just to wrap up and hopefully whet your appetite to come and have a chat to me over the next few days. How do we do this? It's not mystical and magical. How have they achieved the positive influence on animal location? It's about allowing animals to express individual choices, guiding their choices toward our goals by cueing positive consequences and experiences with very clear signals and reinforcing those signals over time. We have a lot of strategies that we're developing. I'm not going to go through those, not only for time, but it's a better thing to sit down with people individually. But it's not just one thing we're trying, it's to layer multiple approaches. And I'm finishing with a few photos to show you how simple it can be, that the cues that we're providing, which is giving very clear signals to animals, where rewards are provided that attract them to an area rather than to distract them away from somewhere else. It can be whistles, clanging bells that they make. It can be CDs glinting in the sun, bird tape glinting. It can be very dilute molasses used as a smell and taste attractant, not as a supplement but as an attractant. Tactile opportunities where on this attractant coat hanger, as we call it, is sound, polypipe that cattle love chewing on, chain, bits of pipe for them to make a noise and hang around, which in itself draws other cattle to that or any livestock to that region. So collectively, we see a range of benefits to landholders and a range of benefits to landscapes. And the more we interact with pastoralists, the more we're being encouraged to see that they want to try these things for a much greater range of reasons than we ever imagined, which puts us back to the opening statement that they can change. We can do it relatively quickly and cheaply, and we're sure it will have long-lasting effects on the business. Thank you.